Oh, hello. There we are. My big point. So let's look at some of these early Cold War policies that reflect this big point. First, the Marshall Plan, named for Secretary of State George Marshall, who did a lot to sell the program around the United States in 1948, more technically known as the European Recovery Plan, because it was an economic plan for European recovery. Think of the Marshall Plan, as you kind of see pictured here in American cartoons, as a stimulus program for Western Europe. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States would give $12.4 billion in aid money to European states with the goal of helping them to recover, European recovery, right? I think we offered the money to everyone except for Spain. They were having a bit of a civil war going on. We have offered it to the Soviet Union, but we pretty much knew that they would turn it down. What I want you to understand about the Marshall Plan is the mixture of imperialism and altruism, or self-interest in altruism, in this particular program, and we'll unpack it in this kind of way. First, on kind of the heavier-handed side of the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan money was not given to European states for, without strings attached. We set up a Marshall Plan agency in Europe to distribute the funds. Their philosophy was trade, not aid. Meaning we're not giving, France, we're not giving you billions of dollars so you can feed your population and provide medical supplies for them, even though France needed that. We're giving you this money so that you can buy the equipment you need to rebuild your roads, rebuild your factories, rebuild your cities, so that you can put people back to work, so that you can start buying American again. Trade, not aid. This Marshall Plan was to stimulate, to recover European free markets, put people back to work, so that it could be begin buying again and be buying American again. In fact, a lot of Marshall Plan money actually made its way back into the United States. Europe received this money, and then they turned around and spent the money in the United States building heavy machinery like bulldozers and dump trucks and earth movers, and all the equipment that they needed to rebuild from the war. So it's just kind of the Marshall Plan is a Keynesian program, but it's also a fascinating corporate welfare program too, where the United States gives European states billions of dollars, but then those billions of dollars make their way back into the American economy to American corporations who are selling this heavy equipment to the Soviet Union. So it's this kind of weird indirect stimulus program for American industry. But it does speak to the heavy-handedness that we were interested not just in European recovery, but in a particular kind of European recovery. Second, the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan included all kinds of propaganda, everything from advertisements that you see here to classes. The Marshall Plan had like classes on like business and marketing and mass production, and basically like training Europeans how to do things the American way, to value efficiency over tradition. And we even produced a bunch of Marshall Plan films intended to convince Europeans to, the films are largely seen as kind of a form of Americanization. I'm not going to take the time to show you the films in this video, but I will post 2 of the Marshall Plan videos in course materials around this lecture, so you can kind of watch them. You can see what the Americans are trying to do in terms of, I think in one of the videos you'll see, you'll see, I think in both of the videos, kind of arguments against protectionism and arguments in favor of free trade, division of labor, all these kind of things that Americans think constitute the American way of doing capitalism. We were trying to impose that, if you will, upon the Europeans. And then finally, not only were we interested in a particular kind of French recovery or English recovery, but a particular kind of European recovery, meaning that we wanted, Marshall Plan money was intended to rebuild, and you can kind of see it there in that Frey Bonn poster. We were interested in a particular kind of Europe emerging from the post-war years and emerging from Marshall Plan money. Marshall Plan money was trying to stimulate Europe towards a particular kind of recovery, one in which borders, Bonn, students who speak German can know better than me. What students have told me in the past is Bonn is more than simply free trade. It's more than open borders. It's more than cultural exchange. It's kind of all of these things, but kind of a less France, England, Germany, more of Europe was the intention of Marshall Plan money. So not only are we trying to, in many ways, colonize Europe's economies through Marshall Plan money, but we are trying to, in many ways, colonize their sensibility, not just Americanizing them, but in some ways Europeanizing them, getting them to stop thinking of themselves in national terms and start thinking of themselves in more regional terms. So there's a definite heavy-handedness to the Marshall Plan, which might make the Marshall Plan look more like Henry Luce. Remember, Henry Luce had said, American leadership of the world should be by such means as we see fit and for which purposes as we see fit. And so the Marshall Plan might fit that heavy-handed Americanization of Western Europe at a point of its weakness. But there does seem to be a lot of Henry Wallace helping other people achieve their own ambitions in this too. First, understand it's not like Europe was like, no, we're good, and the Americans were like, no, you're taking this money. Europe was asking for this money. In fact, Europe came to the United States in 1947 saying, we need more help recovering. European lobbyists were actually asking for somewhere around $24 billion for the United States. We will give about half of that. But understand, Europe was asking for this money, which has led some historians to call the Marshall Plan empire by invitation. It's the idea that if America acted in imperial ways after World War II, it's because they were invited to do so. We weren't forcing this money on Europe. Europe was saying, give us this money. And the United States did. Second, yes, it's true, Marshall Plan money technically went to trade, not aid kinds of redevelopment. But the United States gave all kinds of, we were doing that Good Samaritan of the entire world, or at least the Good Samaritan of Western Europe, maybe not Asia. Good Samaritan of Western Europe, we were doing all kinds of food and medical supplies. The Marshall Plan was incredibly popular in Europe. It remains today incredibly popular. Winston Churchill would call the Marshall Plan the most unselfish act in human history. My advisor in graduate school, her grandmother was in Germany at this time, and her remembrance of the Marshall Plan was not the movies, not the Earth Movers. Her Marshall Plan was Americans dropping food and medical supplies out of the sky. Europeans loved America for the Marshall Plan. And third, yeah, it's true, the United States wanted Europe to move towards a kind of integrated regional economy and society, but Europeans wanted that too. I mean, Europeans weren't idiots. They realized that throughout their history, every few years somebody sneezes and that whole section of the world goes to war, right? It's a place of abundant population and scarce resources. that tends to fuel conflict. And so Europe, particularly after World War One, is trying to figure, even before World War One, right? As early as the 1890s, there's a huge push for how do we, settle this part of the world down? How do we settle Western Europe down? And they thought they had taken the steps before World War One. It doesn't work out. After World War One, there is a great push for European unity. A couple of businessmen would write a book in 1930, The United States of Europe. We need to do what the Americans did. The United States built a United States of America. We need to build a United States of Europe. Ironically, they said we needed to build a United States of Europe to resist American takeover of our markets. Hitler wasn't too keen on the idea. The Depression kind of ruined things. And so the United States of Europe does not happen during the 1930s. After World War II, there is a renewal for that. In fact, Winston Churchill will go before the European Unity Movement conference in 1949 and say, we have to become the United States of Europe. We have to build the United States of Europe. We have to do what the Americans did. And this time, Europe will follow that lead. In 1957, the creation of the European Economic Community, very small step at this time. Only 6 states were kind of a part of this, but the European Economic Community was formed with in their mission statement, it said ever closer union. And so they saw this really as the movement towards a true European unity or a true United States of Europe. Of course, you might not have heard of the European Economic Community, but you are familiar with the next steps of that, right? In 1994, the creation of the European Union, which is still even minus Brexit, the European Union is still there today. More than just kind of the political, social union, but the economic union, even a common currency in some places, although the future of the Eurozone, the future of the European Union in general is very uncertain at this time, particularly after Brexit. I'll say 2 things. One, it's easy for Americans to kind of point at the European Union and laugh and say, you guys don't know how to get along. Just understand that after 1776 and after even 1789, that it was Europe looking at the United States and laughing at us saying, you guys don't know how to get along. You guys remember the whole Civil War thing? Yeah, we create a United States of America in 1787, but we don't actually get to that United States of America until probably about 1920. And even then, I think our own day suggests how tenuous a sense of unity, of national unity, really is. So all this is to say, cut Europe some slack. We Americans should not be laughing at the European Union. We should be, look, what's the alternative to a European Union? If this thing falls apart, what's going to happen? What happens when things fall apart? When things fall apart historically, people go to war. Is that the Europe we want to return to? And so I would think that just as we would have wanted Europe to encourage, applaud our attempts to build a United States of America in the 18th and 19th century, we need to be on the side of the European Union in the 20th and the 21st century. Because the alternative seems, the alternative in our history and in their history seems to be an undesirable one. Second thing I'll say is, and more importantly for this lecture, this is the United States. This is very Henry Wallace, isn't it? Henry Wallace was about the United States should help other countries achieve their own destinies, achieve their own aims. yes, we wanted Europe to move in the direction of economic integration, but Europe wanted to move in the direction of economic integration. So it's possible to understand the Marshall Plan not simply as us imposing a particular vision on Europe. It's possible to understand the Marshall Plan as us providing funds to enable Europe to achieve something that it wanted to achieve anyways, which was not just European recovery, but a sense of European identity out of the nationalisms that had torn that place apart in the past. And so that's the Marshall Plan. The Dodge Plan has been called sometimes been called a Marshall Plan for Japan. It's a little bit different. Understand the context. The United States from 1945 to 1952 is the political and military authority over Japan. We were helping to rebuild Japan during this time. For people who say, you can't build countries, you can't build democracy in other countries. The United States can't export democracy to other countries. Japan stands there as a model of saying, in many ways, you can. Our work in Japan is in many ways a model for how you can go about doing this, shifting Japan away from the military culture that it was from the 1870s all the way into the 1940s to what it would become after 1952 is really quite remarkable. But it did necessitate some shifts. Around 1948, American policy, according to Japanese historians, underwent what they call reverse course. One of the reverse courses was the feeling that Japan needed to economically recover in a way, it needed to recover in a different way. There was a lot of, between 45 and 48, there was a lot of freedom for Japan to build an integrated economy, kind of a mixed economy, even socialist economy, and the United States was even supporting that. In 1948, the United States reverses course, according to these historians, and say what they're trying to, what the United States prioritizes is kind of the pre-war Japan. The pre-war Japan was about 20 to 30% of its economy was export. And the other 70, 80% was like farming, and it was just a pretty stagnant, on-dynamic economy. And after 1948, that's what the United States really prioritizes, is a Japan that recovers prosperity rapidly through its 20 to 30% of export, and domestically just whatever. We kind of stopped caring about that 70 or other 80% of their economy. We're really concerned with rebuilding Japan with what we call the workshop of the Far East. The Dodge Plan was a kind of indirect Marshall Plan. What it did was fix the currency. It fixed the value of the yen very low to the U.S. dollar. I think it fixed the yen at like 360 yen equaled $1. And I know this is technical currency stuff. I don't even fully understand it myself, but basically fixing the currency at 360 to 1 means that the U.S. dollar can go extremely far in Japan's economy. It means Japan's not going to be buying a lot from the United States, right? Because U.S. things and U.S. products and dollars can be pretty expensive. But it does mean that the United States will be incentivized to buy a lot from Japan. And so after 1948, Japan begins to flood the American market. So you're familiar with this now with China, right? After 1998, China is able to flood American consumer markets with its goods. It's hard to go to Walmart today. In the early 90s, Walmart was part of the Buy American campaign. But by 2000, it became nearly impossible to find anything in Walmart that's not made in Japan, made in China. And it's because of how China developed its economy and how the U.S. Prioritized a trade relationship with China that would allow China to massively export into the United States. Well, before we did that with China, we did that with Japan through the Dodge Plan. the Dodge Plan encouraged Americans to buy Japanese products over American products. We need to take a step back and think about that. Right? It's one thing for the United States to give billions of dollars to Germany under the Marshall Plan, which we did. We gave about $3 billion to Germany under the Marshall Plan. Didn't we just spend a lot of money destroying Germany? Didn't Germany kill, hundreds of thousands of American citizens? And here we are helping them rebuild. But it's one thing to kind of explain that, right? Well, look, we need Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union. We need to create those what their Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson called situations of strength in Europe. So we need a strong Germany to resist Soviet incursion, both military but economic as well too. We need a strong Germany, and so. Yeah, we spent billions of dollars blowing Germany up, but now we have to spend billions of dollars helping them rebuild because we need them as an ally. You can kind of understand that logic, but Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Did you know what Japan did to American POWs that they captured? They engaged in kamikaze warfare against American ships. Japan? And now we dropped atomic bombs on Japan. And now just 3 years later, we are helping them rebuild in a way that we're encouraging Americans to buy Japanese products over American-made products. How? Well, it has everything to do with what's going on with Asia at that time. Remember who was supposed to be the other member of the Security Council? Britain, Soviet Union, United States, France, and not Japan. Japan was a luxury we thought we could afford. It's supposed to be China. What is happening in China in 1948? A continuing civil war there between the Western-backed Chiang Kai-shek and the popular Soviet-backed Mao Zedong. This civil war is raging on. It's really unclear what direction China is going to go once this civil war is settled. And so that's why it's in 1948 the United States realizes we need, if we don't hold Japan as an ally, both in terms of its economy, if we don't economically integrate Japan into the world economy, like this is a luxury we can't afford anymore. We need Japan to remain as an ally, but also as a free enterprise ally too. And so it's largely the thinking that we're not going to be able to rely upon China that causes us to reverse course regarding Japan. And Japan suddenly becomes the bulwark towards not just Soviet, but Chinese communist expansion throughout Asia too. We need Japan as an ally. And so you can explain why the United States reverses course on Japan and engages in policies that prioritize Japanese businesses over American businesses. We can kind of understand that. But it's still weird. It's weird to consider that today. We spent billions blowing Japan up, and we essentially gave billions of dollars through this trade policy. We essentially gave billions of dollars back to Japan after the war. It was an irony that was not lost on people at the time. In fact, they made a movie about it, The Mouse That Roared. Let's watch the trailer of this and we'll unpack it a little bit. I'm sorry, we might have to sit through an ad first.
And now another pretty good tweet.
Presented by Same Game Parlay, only on FanDuel Sportsbook.
Stay away from...
Here's the funniest war ever waged. The war that had to be lost to be won.
thing. The United States and the Grand Duchy of Fenwick are at war, and it takes the FBI to find out about it.
The United States invaded by the smallest country in the world.
Hey, see that big building?
Well?
Well, I saw it first. It's mine.
The Mouse That Roared, the film that united the nations in roars of laughter. Starring an hilarious new personality, Peter Sellers, in 3 gloriously funny roles. Peter Sellers as the noble statesman.
There isn't a more profitable undertaking for any country than to declare war on the United States and to be defeated.
Peter Sellers as the fearless leader.
Men of Fenwick, when you hear the name of Grand Fenwick, do your hearts swell with pride?
Yes!
And if your country calls, will you rush to enlist?
No!
Oh.
Peter Sellers as the Grand Duchess.
Do give my love to your president, will you? And Mrs. Coolidge, too.
See this man of many parts and the woman in his life who opens her arms to this lovesick, seasick man of war.
You can turn around right now and kiss me if you want to.
Really?
Really?
Meanwhile, back in Grand Fenwick, the happy citizens prepare to welcome the victorious American army. But little do they know the tragic truth.
Well, Your Grace, I knew it'll come as a surprise, a pleasant one, I hope, but we sort of won.
Sort of what?
We guarantee that this is the
so what's going on in The Mouse That Roared? It's built on this irony that the United States, after World War II, it spent billions of dollars blowing countries up in World War II, and then spends billions of dollars rebuilding them after World War II in the Cold War. So this fictional country of Fenwick, its economy was based upon wine production. Well, in the post-war years, this California producer starts making this wine called exactly what the Fenwick wine is called, coca wine. And everybody starts buying the American, the California wine, and not from this country. This country is on the verge of bankruptcy. And you saw the prime minister in that clip. The Queen, Parliament, they're trying to figure out what do we do? And the prime minister stands up and says, "We need to declare war on the United States." To which Parliament responds, like, are you crazy? Like, that would be like Rhode Island trying to fight the United States. Like, it can't happen. We'll lose. And the prime minister is like, yeah, that's the point. We'll lose. As he says, there's no more profitable undertaking that a country can take than to attack the United States and to lose. The United States, he says, the United States forgives everybody. We will attack the United States. They will defeat us, and then they will rebuild us. Of course, the premise of the movie was all, based upon them actually losing in the war. And, well, if you want to watch the movie, you can. As you saw at the end of the clip that I played there, we sort of won. It's a pretty crazy film. I'm not sure if it's worth watching, but its historical value is immense. Pointing out this irony that regarding countries like Germany and Japan, the United States spent billions of dollars blowing those countries up, and then spent billions of dollars rebuilding them. But again, we thought we had to in terms of our Cold War policy. Understand that the Marshall Plan, the Dodge Plan, fits with Truman's speech. Truman says when he's talking about the assistance that the free world needs to give to countries who are undergoing armed aggression from totalitarian powers, right? He never names the Soviet Union in that address. It should be primarily, he says, of an economic flavor, right? And the Marshall Plan was an economic program. The Dodge Plan was an economic program. The Soviets didn't exactly like it, I should say, from the Soviet perspective. They saw the Truman Doctrine speech as a declaration of war against themselves. They saw the Marshall Plan and the Dodge Plan as efforts in what the Soviets called capitalist encirclement. The Marshall Plan, and this, again, to go back to the big point I left off with in lecture 1, right? The Americans played up the Soviet threat. The Soviet threat was real, but the United States also exaggerated the Soviet threat in order to accomplish its primary goals, which was to rebuild other economies so that they could recover prosperity and begin buying American again. Right? The Marshall Plan was needed to make up for the shortfalls of the Bretton Woods system. The Marshall Plan would inject more cash into European economies than Bretton Woods could supply under the guise of containing, stopping the Soviet threat. George Marshall traveled around the country selling the European Recovery Plan, not as this is a way to ensure American prosperity. He sold it as this is a way to ensure that Soviet aggression is contained, is held back. So again, understand how Americans used the threat of the Soviet Union, both real and imagined, to engage in policies that would help the United States allies recover their economies, which ultimately would help the United States. We're doing this in Western Europe. We're doing this in Asia. We are using the Soviet threat to ensure our economic and political ambitions at home. The Soviets are doing the same thing. They take the Truman Doctrine. They take this idea of capitalist encirclement. We're saying, the commies are coming to get us. Well, Stalin and the Soviets are saying the capitalists are coming to get us. They're trying to encircle us with this Marshall Plan business, right? They're trying to destabilize the Soviet Union. This provides an occasion for Uncle Joe to tell the Soviet people, hey, you don't want other leadership. You don't want liberalization of our political system, of our economy. We need strong leadership to stand up against the Americans. It's the exact same logic that a Kim Jong-un used to maintain control over North Korea today. You need to follow my heavy-handed leadership. If you don't, the Americans are going to invade us and destroy us. The Soviets did exactly that same thing. Used the American threat, played up the American threat in order to promote Stalin's rule and communist control over the Soviet Union after the upsets of World War II. So understand, both sides are engaging in this kind of use of the threat of the other in order to achieve domestic economic and political gains. The United States is certainly doing that too. All right, to get back on track, American Cold War policy initially was of an economic nature that begins to shift in 1949 with the introduction of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which is of course still there today. NATO is, kind of a mini League of Nations. The League of Nations, remember, it's collective security principle, establishing a kind of global defensive pact. NATO establishes a defensive pact on a regional scale. NATO members pledge to safeguard each other in case of some kind of an attack. Most of that support came from the United States. Most NATO troops, most NATO military hardware would be supplied by the United States, because it had to be. Two things about NATO to keep in mind. One, this did serve an economic purpose, right? As the person who put this into place, Dean Acheson, as he explained the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this was about helping to restore confidence of Europeans that was needed for economic investment. I'm kind of directly quoting him there. Further economic investment of Europeans in their economic recovery required a sense of confidence. Think about it. You're a German a Western German businessman. You're being encouraged by Germany. Hey, go ahead and take out a loan, rebuild that factory, rebuild your industry, put people to work. And you're the German businessman saying, why should I do that when the Soviets might come in and take over next year? NATO sent a message not just to the Soviet Union. NATO sent a message to Europe, particularly to Western Europe. Go ahead and rebuild. NATO's got your back. The Soviets will not invade. They will not risk World War III because they will confront the NATO forces. They'll encounter the American war machine if they do. So NATO served an economic purpose. It was largely about sending a message to Western Europe to continue to rebuild their economies, put people to work, with the understanding that the Soviets would not risk taking on U.S. forces through NATO. But understand as well, NATO signals a shift in American Cold War policy as well too. Now we are not just putting dollars into Europe. We're putting troops. We're putting American military hardware into Europe. It is possible that the Cold War could have remained of an economic nature. The United States investing money in its allies, the Soviets investing money in its allies. Dollar diplomacy was central to the Cold War. From 1946 and 7 all the way up till 1991, when the Soviet Union finally collapses. Dollar diplomacy is always there, and it could have remained of an economic nature. It begins to shift here in 1949 with the United States. Am I blaming the United States for militarizing the Cold War? Assigning blame in the Cold War is really difficult because it's a constant misreading of each other's intentions. It is suspicion, if not paranoia, leading to self-fulfilling prophecies. So on the thought that the Soviets were planning World War III, which the suggestion is they were not, but on the off chance that they might, or at least just to use the threat that they might to try to help European economies grow further, we established NATO. NATO sends a message to the Soviet Union. The Americans are doing more than just capitalist encirclement now. This is military encirclement. They literally are planning to get us. Become even more dramatic when we start putting missiles in Turkey, for instance, aimed at the Soviet Union. Countries get a little freaked out when you put missiles in their backyards aimed at them, right? Americans kind of understand that from Cuba. Well, we did that first with putting missiles in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union. They weren't too happy about that. And so it does seem that the Americans are the ones who militarize the Cold War first under NATO, but it's only because we believe that the Soviets were doing the same. And it is true that during these years, the Soviets were, building up their military. They were developing an atomic bomb. So they were preparing for World War III as well, too. Just they felt the Americans were the ones who were going to start it. And so it's just, again, trying to say that one side or the other is more to blame in this is really difficult. The reality is you're dealing with two countries, both with expansionary ambitions. We just, as Americans, we play up the Soviet side. Of course, they were communists. They wanted to, make the world communist. And the Americans were just, defending the free world, as Truman explained in his speech. Well, we weren't. Capitalist economies, as Luce made plain, as was made plain at the beginning of this lecture, capitalist economies were based upon expansion as well, too. You can't have capitalism in just one country. So you had two expansionary states coming into conflict with each other. And in 1949, it begins to take a military turn. But again, the militarization of the Cold War would help the United States solve some of its, problems. More propaganda from the Marshall Plan. And so we need to end off our lecture talking about the emergence in the 1950s of, really in the 1940s, of military Keynesianism. Now, we talked about Keynesianism before. This might be a really good subject for one of your observations for the second exam. Just looking at the varieties of Keynesianism. We looked at Keynesianism in terms of public works programs, in terms of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. We looked at Keynesianism in terms of what the Bretton Woods system was intended to do. The Marshall Plan was a kind of global Keynesianism. But the primary form of Keynesianism the United States would engage in from World War II to the present was military Keynesianism. That's government spending on weapons of little and mass destruction. Government deficit spending on weapons of little and mass destruction in order to promote economic advance, but economic stability as well too. Right? Keynesian projects serve more than just kind of stimulating a bad economy. They're in many ways about stabilizing or promoting particular industries over others as well too historically, and that is the case with military Keynesianism. It's military Keynesianism, in other words, is this Keynesianism of a military bent. And you can kind of understand why the United States would go down the military Keynesian road. Remember that question I asked you to put a pin in. A country can't just keep making weapons of little and mass destruction forever, can it? At some point, war economies have to revert to peace economies, right? In the case of World War II and the Cold War, the answer for the United States is no. We never really do fully convert back to a peacetime economy. It's interesting. Actually, the first Americans to kind of recognize this problem, even before we were in the war, they recognized the problem of the arsenal of democracy. It was churches. And churches were complaining in 1940, particularly peace churches, were complaining, look, the United States is putting millions of Americans back to work, but in defense industries. What's going to happen when the war is over? We're not going to be able to fire these people. We're going to have to keep making weapons forever. We're going to have a war economy forever. And then these journalists in 1943 started writing about America's permanent war economy, saying, look, again, we put millions of Americans back to work. We're not going to be able to stop doing this. We're going to have to make weapons of little and mass destruction forever. We have built, in order to defeat Germany's war economy, we have built our own war economy, and we're not going to be able to stop doing it. It's the Cold War that provides the justification for the United States to continue building weapons of little and mass destruction for two purposes. One, to create those situations of strength to contain the Soviets, but two, to keep millions of Americans at work. Again, military Keynesianism is a great example of how American Cold War policies serve two purposes: containing the Soviets, but also providing for economic stability and, in many ways, economic advance at home. In many ways, the Bible or the blueprint of military Keynesianism was NSC 68. It stands for National Security Council Document Number 68. The NSC was created in 1947. NSC 68 was just simply the 68 document that they produced. The NSC was quickly supplanting the State Department in charge of planning for America's engagement with the world, particularly our engagement with the Soviets. NSC 68 was written in response to two problems in late 1949. One, China had been united, but under the communist leadership of Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. China is now officially a communist state. And the Soviets had successfully detonated their own atomic bomb. What did this mean? How does American policy need to change in light of these two really existential crises? The country, the largest country in the world falling under communist leadership, and what we consider to be the center of global communism, now having an atomic bomb. What are they going to do? NSC 68 says communists were looking to, quote, impose their absolute authority on the rest of the world. In NSC 68, the vision is of what Eisenhower in the 1950s would call international communism. It was no longer communism or Soviet communism, it was international communism. The belief beginning with NSC 68 was that the Soviets and the Chinese were like this. They were lockstep in looking to export the communist revolution throughout Western Europe and ultimately to the United States. That's not true. Certainly not in 1949 and 1950. In fact, the Soviets withdrew all their ambassadors once Chairman Mao took over. They didn't know what was going to happen with China. And in fact, it was the changes of U.S. policy during the 1950s that actually drove the Soviets and the Chinese closer together. Until about 1964, when they split apart again, China wanted the Soviets to help them build an atomic bomb. The Soviets refused to do so. And so through most of the Cold War, these two communist powers were on the outs. I had a friend who grew up in China during the 70s and 80s. And he was in northern China. He said, look, my family and I, we had like a second home out in the caves. Out in northern China. Everybody did. And he said it wasn't because we were afraid of the Americans, because we were afraid of the Soviets. We lived under constant fear that the Soviets and the Chinese were going to go to war against each other. So, except for about a 10-year span between 1954, about 1952, 1962, the Soviets and the Chinese, they just were not in lockstep with each other. But nevertheless, NSC 68 said they were, and they said they absolutely were coming to get us. So what did the United States need to do? It needed to take the military threat now more seriously. NSC 68 recommended increasing American defense spending about fourfold. I think we were spending about $10 billion in 1950. NSC 68 is saying we need to spend like $50 billion a year on national defense, which would represent about 40% of the entire budget of the U.S. federal government. We just spent like $50 billion a year. NSC 68 was given to Truman in April of 1950. He read it and said, "Oh, that's nice. Keep that in mind. Put it on the shelf." September of 1950, takes it off the shelf, says, "Oh my goodness, we need to do this, and we need to do this like yesterday." And NSC 68 goes on to become the blueprint of the Cold War. What changed? And I realize the answer is kind of there on the screen. What changed between April and September of 1950? It's right there. The Korean War. In June of 1950, North and South Korea had been, going back and forth at each other for about 3 years now. Finally, North Korea launches a whole-scale invasion of South Korea in June of 1950. And it looks like what NSC 68 had said was true. It looked like the communist world was united and was coming to take over the free world. Now, calling South Korea at this time the free world is a little silly. Calling the communist world united behind North Korea is also pretty silly. The reality is that the Chinese are providing, the Chinese support for this North Korean invasion was not that great. And the Soviets did not much more than just kind of helping to plan it. But again, that's only because the Chinese and the Soviets believed the Americans were doing the same thing on the South Korean side, which we weren't necessarily planning an invasion, should I say, but we were helping the South Koreans during this time. In fact, what will bring the Chinese into the war is when the United States, through NATO, drive North Koreans back across the 38th parallel, but then try to unite Korea under South Korean leadership. When the United States crosses the 38th parallel, tries to conquer North Korea, with the goal ultimately of bombing and reconquering China. That was the ambition of many Americans at the time, including the person who was in charge of the Korean War, Douglas MacArthur. He kept begging Truman to give him access to like atomic bombs. Finally said, just give me 10 atomic bombs and I can win China back. And he was, many Americans were just openly desperate to use atomic bombs against the Chinese in ways they never talked that way about the Soviets. There's racial dynamics here at play. Ultimately, we don't use atomic weapons, but we do end up in a stalemate in South Korea because of this. NSC 68 seems to be proven by the Korean War, or at least American policymakers used the Korean War to follow through on the program of NSC 68. Dean Acheson reportedly said, "Thank God for the Korean War," because it gave the United States the cover to not have to convert to a peacetime economy. Instead, to reinvest in weapons of little and mass destruction for two purposes: to help keep the Soviets contained, but also to help the American economy through providing billions of dollars into defense industry jobs that would have eventually lost if we really had to convert to a peacetime economy. Charles Wilson was Secretary of Defense under Eisenhower. He was one of the persons who pushed the idea of a permanent war economy as a good thing. It was good in that it helped us build the weapons that we needed to resist the Soviets, but it was also good because it helped keep millions of Americans at work. Let's talk a little bit about military Keynesian policies. Just first understand that as the United States, in the midst of the Korean War, increased its military budget to about $50 billion a year for the sake of the Korean War, but also to put to advance NATO and just our armed forces in general. That did help the American economy. Millions, you'll see this in Eisenhower's speech, millions of Americans were kept or were put to work in the defense industry through being able to maintain kind of the specter of the Soviet threat and the specter of international communism. It allowed the United States to keep millions of Americans at work. In this case, not to stimulate the economy, because the American economy is doing well, but to stabilize the American economy. If we have a depression or recession, at least defense jobs are essentially recession-proof. These jobs will maintain through economic highs, through economic lows. We can keep millions of Americans at work in the defense industry. America saw, you might have heard of the Sun Belt. Some historians talk about a gun belt that was formed during these years as certain sectors, certain regions of the American economy benefited from government contracts flooding in, including Orange County, California. Orange County in the 1960s, roughly 40% of everyone who lived in Orange County. Orange County is where Disneyland currently is. About 40% of people who worked in Orange County worked for the Department of Defense, building weapons of little and mass destruction. So massive social restructuring was taking place in the 1950s through our military spending in the United States. Again, serving this dual purpose, they're building weapons of little and mass destruction to help contain the Soviets abroad, but it's also helping our economy in terms of keeping millions of Americans at work, who then go out and spend that money and helps the economy, right? The logic still holds today. Millions of Americans still work in the defense industry. It's just, it's the percentage of America, because there's so many more Americans today. It's really hard to get numbers of how many Americans work in defense jobs. It's very difficult to find that. We know it's in the millions, but it's really hard to know exact figures. It has to be, I would think, more than 3.5 million around the country. But because our population is so much bigger today, it's such a smaller percentage of Americans. And because our economy is so much larger today, our defense budget, even though it's way bigger than $50 billion, it's still a smaller fraction of our economy. It's not like 40% like it was in the 1950s and 1960s. It's just smaller today. So there's the domestic, and I should say too, besides keeping millions of Americans at work, Keynesian programs, government contracts engage in, well, let's not talk about picking losers so much as picking winners, meaning government can, through its deficit spending, government, and particularly the military, can engage in research which will help the military, but also help peacetime industries as well too. So two industries that received a lot of defense research money in the 50s and 60s were aviation and computers. What are Americans pretty good at? Aviation and electronics. Who builds the first internet? Who builds the first computers? That's the military. That's not private industry, right? We have so many stories we tell ourselves about, private industry and private initiative doing this and doing that. We need to understand how much of American society and America's economy has been shaped by Defense Department research as a part of military Keynesianism policies going back to the 1950s. Right? I mean, who built our first computers? Who built the internet? Where does all that come from? Where do our advanced aviation in the United States comes from? It all comes from defense spending. So understand how much of America's private economy was rooted in military Keynesian policies. Internationally speaking, though, too, military Keynesianism allows the United States to, after Marshall Plan money dried up, to continue to help certain regions of the world, namely Japan and Western Europe, continue to recover in absence of Marshall Plan money. The Mutual Security Act. Between 1951, under the Mutual Security Act, the United States will give out $120 billion to 90 different countries. They would give billions of dollars to these countries with a kind of dual purpose, helping to keep those countries from going communist or resisting communists, but also to help those countries economically advance. And in some ways, even backdooring American industry through Keynesian policies too. The Mutual Security Act is really interesting. We'll take the situation of Egypt, for instance. Beginning in the 1970s and through the 1980s and all the way to the present, Egypt will receive every year roughly about $2 billion. We give Israel about $3 billion. We give Egypt about $2 billion every year. Most of that money gets spent in the U.S. economy as Egypt buys U.S. military hardware. I think we do the same thing with the Saudis too. But it's this kind of weird. It's the Marshall Plan, but now of a military flavor. We give billions of dollars in aid to other countries, but then we ask that those countries then buy military hardware from the United States too. And so these programs like the Mutual Security Act, they end up as these kind of Keynesian stimulus programs for American defense industries, as this money is given out in foreign aid, but then comes back to the United States. It's weird stuff when we actually kind of follow the money. The offshore procurement program, kind of the last thing we'll talk about today. An interesting program where the United States paid foreign workers to make military hardware for the United States. At one point in the 1950s, 235,000 Italians worked for the U.S. Department of Defense. At one point in the 1950s, 70% of Japanese exports were U.S. military hardware. We are paying Western Europeans, we are paying the Japanese to build military hardware for us. Shouldn't those jobs go to American workers? Why are we paying foreign workers to build these things? There is a strategic dimension to the offshore procurement program. Whereas the United States fighting in the 1950s, we're fighting in Asia. So doesn't it make sense to have Japan be building weapons of little and mass destruction for us? Because, it cuts down on shipping costs to get a little closer from, say, Japan to Korea than, say, from California or North Carolina to Korea. And the same thing with NATO. We need to supply NATO troops. Doesn't it make sense to have Europeans build American military hardware to supply NATO forces too, rather than to ship these things, make them in the United States and ship them over to Europe? So there is a strategic dimension to this. But there is this other component too, in that we are helping to continue European and Japanese recovery. In absence of Marshall Plan money, we are continuing to provide money for these economies to continue to recover, but now under the auspices of military hardware. The Japanese Prime Minister would call the Korean War the gift of the gods. Because even though Japan would not fight, Japan's a pacifist state according to its constitution of 1952. Japan would nevertheless build American military hardware, which helped Japan rebuild particularly its export industries, and fast-track Japan to becoming the world's, a country that is in ruins in 1945. Is by the 1970s the world's second leading economy. It had everything to do with American economic policies and helping to rebuild Japan, but including programs like the offshore procurement program. And I'll add this too. How did the Japanese get so good at making cars with engines that run forever? It's because we paid them to do so. Look, do Americans not know how to build engines that will run for 200, 300, 400,000 miles? Of course we do. Of course we know how to build engines like that. We just don't have an incentive to build engines like that. We want you buying a new car every year, or every 2 years, or every 5 years. We don't want engines that will run forever. That's not good for a consumer economy like the United States. But when it comes to U.S. military, that's a different story. We want those engines to run forever. And so the engines that are in American Jeeps and Hummers, those things will run forever, right? But we've been reluctant to put those kind of technology into our domestic industry because, again, we're afraid that Americans will keep driving our cars. Japan wasn't afraid of that. We taught Japan to build engines in American military vehicles that would run for 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 miles. And Japan's like, hey, we should put these kinds of engineering technology in our cars. And so Japan sells cars in the United States with engines that will run for, we got a 2003 Toyota RAV. It's now granted, it's needed a lot of transmission work, and it's actually going in the shop for about $400 worth of repairs on Tuesday. But the engine's getting on 300,000 miles, and it's still going. Like, these engines will run forever, the Japanese built. And it's because the Japanese just know something the Americans don't. No, it's because the Americans knew it, and we shared it with the Japanese. You can search it, fact check me on this. I'm not making this stuff up. This is what the United States military policies did. So what is the legacy of military Keynesianism? Did military Keynesian policies like investing in aviation and computers, keeping millions of Americans at work. The Mutual Security Act, Job Share Procurement Program, did it work in terms of keeping the Soviets at bay? Yes, it did. Did it help keep America's economy stable, as well as provide continuing aid for our allies around the world, helping their economies? Yes, it did. Military Keynesianism has been successful, but at what cost? And we can talk about that during discussion if you want to kind of help you with your thinking. You might not have heard of military Keynesianism before, but you have heard of the military-industrial complex, right? Which sounds like a conspiratorial term. Just understand it comes from a Republican President Eisenhower in his farewell speech from 1961. I'm not going to go into this because this is your discussion board exercise. So listen to the speech and answer those questions that are there. But just understand when we talk about the military-industrial complex, this is not some kind of far left conspiracy or something like that. It's a thing that actually has existed since the 1950s. It's a thing that Eisenhower actually helped build and then told Americans to worry about this thing. Should we continue to worry? Should we fear the military-industrial complex today? We can talk about that in class. Hey, thanks for following along with the lecture. See you guys later.